The silent scream. The heavy, oppressive fog of night clung to the town of Hollow's End like a suffocating blanket. The thick air was palpable, and the sounds that broke into the eerie stillness were those of an owl in the distance and a crunch of gravel under the feet of a lone traveler. Lena Harper had inherited a creepy, vine-covered mansion on the outskirts of Hollow's End when she came to town. From what she could gather, it was left to her by her deceased aunt. She thought it'd be an escape from the hurly-burly of city life and a chance to start anew. Her aunt lived there, she read, and from the minute she got there, she felt a stranglehold presence, lively as if the very walls were conscious of every one of her comings and goings. The townsfolk are kind enough to her, but always look at her as having a strange mix of pity and caution. When Lena asked around inquiringly about her aunt, the whispers would spread fast, but no one gave her straight answers. She heard only in the dark corners of the local tavern, over half-empty glasses of whiskey, partial tales of her aunt's errancies, how she locked herself away in the mansion for years, uttering not a word, and the strange, unnatural screams that carried at times from the house, though no one dares investigate. Believing nothing of the stories, Lena hardly paid attention to them, regarding them as something based on superstition. Hollow's End was a small town, and everybody knows that small towns live by folklore. However, with days passing by, this feeling of being stared at increased strongly, more disturbing. She could not resist the feeling that something inside the house was trying to get through to her. It all began with the dreams. She spent each of the 7 nights back in the same place. An infinite corridor lined on both sides, with walls that seemed to exhale a cold breath. There was always a door at the end of the hallway, and always a faint light showed through from beneath. And then, every night, she'd walk towards it, her hand reaching out to open the door, only to wake before her fingers touched the brass knob. Icy to the touch. Every morning she woke drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as if she had run for her life. One evening, desperate for answers, Lena decided to explore the attic. Her aunt kept it locked, but she had found the key hidden in the lining of some old coat. She began climbing up the narrow staircase, where cold began dripping into the air, where the shadows grew a foot longer, and then a far foot longer. The attic door creaked open to reveal a heavy, dust-covered and cobwebbed interior. And while the walls made of ancient trunks, broken furniture, and layers of books attracted no attention at first glance, one thing caught Lena's eye: a large, big-sized, clumsy mirror standing in the corner, only partially covered by a tattered, moth-eaten fabric. Strange compulsion drove her closer to the mirror. The moment she ripped off the cloth, icy air gushed through. This was a mirror unlike any she had ever seen. The surface was black, almost polished obsidian. It seemed to swallow the light around it. For a moment she saw herself, but it wasn't quite right. Her face was there, but her eyes, they were different. Dark, empty, almost as if they were looking back at her from another dimension. The reflection smiled. Lena stepped backward, her heart thudding in her chest. But the image inside the mirror did not track with her. It simply stood there, its mouth curving up into a smile, its eyes glinting with evil. She spun to run, and heard a noise loud enough to be deafening burst across the silence. Only she wasn't making it. It was coming from the mirror. The scream shook the floorboards, echoed through the house, and now resounded inside Lena's head, rattling her bones. She tried to blot out the sound with her palms by pulling her hands up over her ears, but it remained audible, continuing to reverberate inside her head. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped. Silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. Slowly, she turned around to the mirror. Her spine crawled with fear. The reflection was nowhere to be seen. The surface of the mirror is now smooth, black, and empty. But as she peered into its depths, she could feel something staring back. A presence, watching her from the other side. A slam on the attic door. The temperature in the room dropped. Her breath was visible as the icy air parted before it. The walls closed in around her. Shadows in the corner of the room began to writhe and take shape, forming figures that weren't nearly human. She reached out, pushing against the door, hoping that it would come open. It wouldn't budge. Figures moved closer in, but the face she couldn't see. But she could feel their cold, dead eyes on her. She slammed on the door and screamed for help, but it only rang with the soft creaking of the floorboards, which told her of the impending shadows. And then she heard the whisper. It was thin, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. "Let me out." Lena froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The voice came from the mirror. She turned, slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. The mirror was no longer empty. A figure stood behind the glass. Her aunt, gaunt and pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Let me out," the reflection repeated, her voice a trembling whisper. "Please! I didn't mean to." Lena took another step closer to the mirror, her breathing shallow. "Aunt Margaret?" she whispered. The reflection's eyes went wide, her face one of pure desperation. "Don't let it out, Lena. Don't!" She did not finish before the mirror shattered, shards exploding throughout the room. Lena screamed as the glass tore into her skin, but when she opened her eyes, the attic was empty. The mirror was gone, and the shadows had retreated. The door swung open with no resistance at all. Taking a breath of cool, damp air, Lena stumbled out of the attic and ran headlong from the house, not stopping until she reached the town square, panting and frightened. The townsfolk watched as she fell before the old church, gasping for air, her hands shaking wildly. She sat in the safety of the town inn, hearing the local historian's story, his face set in grim lines. He heard what she had to say. He nodded that she was done, but said nothing until his voice came, so low it was almost a whisper with its own weight of sorrow. "The mirror was cursed," he said. "Your aunt tried to destroy it, but she couldn't. It trapped her soul, inside, feeding on her fear. You're lucky you escaped." She looked at him, feeling his words. "But what now? What happens now?" The historian shook his head. "The mirror is gone, but its curse remains. It may be waiting for another victim, or maybe it's not done with you yet." That night, as Lena tried to sleep, she again heard it. The faint, distant sound of a scream. Only this time, it wasn't in her dreams. It was inside her house. This should last for around 20 minutes with pacing and atmospheric narration. Let me know if you want anything changed.